Hello, everyone. This is my recording about the task you received at the beginning of the week on the 1st of July, a short TPS exercise and some other questions. And you've raised some questions for me to answer, some very pertinent questions, and I shall do my best. This is different from what our classes were. I'm no longer looking at translation into English, though in our classes in the next few weeks, Peter and I might do fragments of translation if we feel that they illustrate a point or help you to practice something useful. Of course, we're still waiting for the composition. Sorry, not the composition. We're still waiting for the rules, the criteria for the composition and the summary, which will come out in the regulations, the EDUTAL. So I'm not going to talk about compositions or summaries today, but as soon as we get the regulations and we know how long the tasks are supposed to be, we know how long the exam will be, and perhaps a bit more about the criteria that they're going to follow, then we'll try to help with those tasks as well. For now, we're going to focus more on TPS and on language issues, difficult words that tend to come up. I would just say that it's pretty much impossible to prepare for all the vocabulary that might hit you in TPS. So, this is a work in progress. You will always be boosting your vocabulary by reading, by recording phrases, perhaps more than words, so that you get used to how they look in their context, collocations, expressions. Keep reviewing those, learning those, noting them from the work you're reading in English. And of course, you can always practice summaries by summarizing the things you're reading as well, even if you just summarize a paragraph of a text in a sentence. So, of course, there's a lot to be getting on with. And I think at this point also, there is this feeling, well, we've got changes, but we're not quite sure what they are. And it's a little bit, I think disturbing's too strong a word, but it certainly makes my mind work overtime, trying to imagine what might be different in the EDUTAL. On the other hand, we can at least just take our minds away from translation and focus more on everything else and all your other subjects. So with that in mind, I'm going to share the screen. I'm sorry that the light's very bright on me, but you soon won't look at me, you'll look at the screen. And I just share the right screen, I hope. So this is the mini TPS. It's a text from 2017. So the where are we now? The last but one US election, the last election that Trump won, rather than Biden. And the first thing I would say is that it is important to look at the source in a TPS. So you quite likely don't know the New Statesman. It is British, it's a periodical. I'm just wondering if I can immediately point to something that makes me know it's British. It takes a little while. I think when you get to paragraph 3, you might begin to think that the writer isn't American. And she does talk about how the point of this story is America, which also makes you think that no, she might be an outsider. not definitely. The New Statesman is a left-wing journal, or not journal, sorry, periodical magazine, really, by the way. So you came up with quite a few questions, and I'm going to go to question 1 here. I'm just going to split my screen so that I can look at 2 things at once. First of all, one of you asked about question 1.1, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be looking all over the place at different, let me just try to get hold of the questions and put them in a place where I can see them. I'm dealing with too many things that open all at once. So 1.1, Barbara pointed out that the expression that dare not speak its name could imply speaking about the ceremony itself. And she wondered if to speak openly of a coronation ceremony seemed to go beyond what the author meant. I think this may be overthinking. I think you may be kind of going beyond what the question, the item, actually was aiming at. But it was a difficult and slightly ambiguous item. And it was made much more difficult for anyone who doesn't recognize the phrase that dare not speak its name. And that's probably most of you, quite honestly. This is a phrase from a piece of writing. I can't remember if it's a poem by Lord Alfred Douglas, who was Oscar Wilde's lover. And, Oscar Wilde was put in prison for having a homosexual relationship with Lord Alfred. Lord Alfred wasn't put in prison because he was a lord and had lots of influential friends. So he was talking about, Alfred was talking about the love that dare not speak its name. And if you don't know that, you're at a disadvantage. Quite honestly, fortunately, in TPS, they're unlikely to refer to something that's so sort of reliant on knowing a bit of British writing from over 100 years ago. So this was quite an unfair question, but I think even not knowing that it's to do with an illegal kind of love, you can tell that these people were getting ready for the coronation that is not being called a coronation. You can't call the investiture of a president a coronation. So a coronation ceremony, basically for me, it's more or less the same thing. They were getting ready for the coronation ceremony. And I think it's reasonable to assume that calling it openly a coronation or a coronation ceremony would cause moral outrage in America. It's a republic. It's totally unacceptable to talk about a coronation. So I think, given the knowledge that you have about the US being a republic, and given the text that you can't call it a coronation, it dare not speak its name, and the fact that the item has the word suggests, you can make a safe guess that this is correct. Okay, I can't really help more than that with this item. It's an educated guess, as are quite a lot of TPS questions. And in fact, Barbara noted that she does guess some of her answers, but you obviously guessed some of them right. The next one, several people asked about the plural there refers back to the singular every child as a way of avoiding gender discrimination. On the next page of this file that I will share with you, there is quite a sort of long key to the TPS with references to dictionaries and so on as evidence. Every child, let me just find every child, just like everybody, everyone, is referring indeed to more than one individual, but it is still referring to the individual as the representative of the class, of the whole class of children. When we use every, we must use a singular verb. So it is correct to call every child the singular. And you cannot use a plural verb with it. Strictly speaking, the possessive there that refers back to every child should be singular too, in strict formal grammar. In the past, it would simply have been his lemonade. Nobody would have worried about it being masculine. Then it might have become to steal his or her lemonade, to be more equal. And it has now become really acceptable to use their, meaning we're covering male and female, even though there is supposedly, it is really grammatically a reference to a plural ownership. So this has arisen from the wish not to discriminate and to be less clumsy than his or her every time. So this is quite important to remember when you're writing. Every person, every child, everyone, everybody, everything, they go with a singular verb. But if you need to refer to them again, you can use their. I'm just going to jump down the page to where I have this slightly more detailed key. And I would say here I've highlighted with non-human nouns, you can use it instead of their. I mean, you must use it, but you mustn't use it with humans. So you can say every computer in the lab has its own password, the computer's own password, its own password. Okay, so we don't exclude its if you're talking about non-animate nouns. Okay, so I'm going to stick by that answer that it is about avoiding gender discrimination. Then we had both uses of whose, in question 1, item 3. Both uses of whose could be replaced by of which. So I accept that you can replace the second one, a religion of which. And then you have to say a religion of which, the rituals, you have to say the rituals. I'm not sure why, it just sounds better. You can just about replace whose. With the first one, you simply cannot say a religion upon of which principles nobody can agree. It's not actually a problem about meaning. It's a problem simply of grammar, of syntax, not semantics. So you have to change the word order in these sentences if you want to use of which. And that's also shown in that pale blue table, which I showed you a moment ago, I've given some examples of how you could use of which. Just remember that when you're using the possessive whose, traditionally people say, oh, you're supposed to use it only with people. You can use it with inanimate things too. So it's being used here to refer to a religion whose principles, a religion whose rituals. And it is quite helpful. It means that you don't write such a complicated sentence, as you'll see in my replacement suggestions in the expanded key. So moving on to 1.4, the word mythos refers to the system of beliefs underlying a particular culture. So that is actually one of its dictionary definitions. And apparently it's quite common to use it just to replace myth or mythology. I must say I've never used it like that. I've never used it. And I think it's more accurate to use it to talk about the system of beliefs rather than a system of myths, which are more like stories behind a culture. So it is definitely true that the word mythos refers to the system of beliefs. You then might ask yourself, is this true in the context of paragraph 4, line 7? Let's see. So it comes after several sentences which describe America, fundamentally religious. Americanism is a religion whose rituals, the election of a president, has enormous symbolic power, holds the heart of the nation. You can criticize him, but the mythos must not be undermined. So the mythos is, I think, something quite close to this religion that she's talking about. It's a system of beliefs underlying American culture. In this particular paragraph, and I think one of you said this in your questions, the president is the embodiment of that culture and that mythos. So the word mythos here does, yes, refer to the president and the rituals surrounding him, but it is still true that it refers to the system of beliefs. The president is the embodiment of that system of beliefs. That's how I interpret it. And I'm interpreting this partly because, that's just how it seems to me. This ritual around the president is the embodiment of something in American culture involving beliefs about the president. But I'm also interpreting it like this because when an item can be true, it almost certainly is true. So even if the word mythos also refers to the president, that does not exclude it from referring to the system of beliefs underlying a particular culture. So I would only mark that wrong if I felt that it's impossible for it to mean that in this context. Okay. So when in doubt, I tend to think this can be true. It can be true in this context. It's not the only truth that I find in this context. I'm more attracted to the truth of it being about the president, but that's not the only truth. It can be true, therefore I will mark it C. And most of the time that will be safer if you believe it can be true. Okay, I'm just looking down my questions here to see if I've missed anything on the TPS. All right, just going to question 2. People didn't have questions about that. The answers are expanded a little bit more in the table that I'm not yet showing you. I'm now going to stop splitting my screen, and I'm going to answer the questions that Janaina raised about a bit more about tone, about xenophobia. So just going down my file, you'll see that each of the questions is repeated more or less in this central column. And on the right, there's some evidence from the text, and then usually some further reference. So here we are, you can see that I've said you can replace whose, thus, and I've done it, I've rewritten it with of which. I've written a bit more about mythos, and then there are just some more sort of dictionary kind of definitions for the plainer vocabulary questions. Then I had questions about tone. Now, I don't think we should immediately panic just knowing that CESB is back in charge. The kind of questions, the kind of texts you get may not change dramatically because of the bunker, the examining board. But of course, they may change because of the people who are chosen as the examiners. And, some of us do remember back in 2016, 2017, some difficult literary texts. We also have seen some very difficult literary texts with EADIS. So this was not a literary text, but I will, Peter and I will probably provide some literary texts for you to practice with. And I have looked at some things that sometimes come up in literary texts. So about tone. This is the hardest thing in your own language. It's even harder in a foreign language. And certainly one of the hardest things is irony. Because irony usually has quite a lot to do with culture and knowing some background. And I think also irony, although Brazilian humorists like irony, British irony is incredibly prevalent in our culture, and it's harder to detect it in a different language. I probably don't detect Brazilians being ironic as easily as I do British people, even though Brazilians are often ironic. So I just will say a couple of things before I look at xenophobia and capital letters, which Janaina asked about. Is the text ironic? I think it is a bit, yes. Actually, I think irony is possibly too polite for the text. I think it's more sarcastic, satirical. But I wouldn't say that it's not ironic. First of all, I notice that it's a left-wing weekly magazine in the UK, which you might not know, but I did, which made it easier for me. And there's then talk about the coronation, which is kind of bizarre, both in terms of the Republic in which it's happening, and in terms of, it's not bizarre in terms of the British magazine, because the British magazine would find that absolutely hilarious, that the presidential inauguration ceremony is rather like a coronation. Then there's I think it's a bit ironic to refer to Oscar Wilde, the lover that dare not speak its name, that that's not very important really, but that possibly, is ironic thinking about Oscar Wilde and how he would have hated Trump. So maybe there's some irony there. But these are very amorphous kinds of irony. And they're maybe, not the best example of traditional irony. I think there's more a bit of sarcasm about Michael, who sounds like, he says very simple, simplistic things. And maybe some sarcasm about the warning about how American children, British children think, American children, getting confused. American children think that the King of England is going to steal their lemonade. I don't actually get that reference at all. And then in the last few lines, the writer talks about Spitting Image, which is a satirical TV program, and it's very different from American TV. And in the last paragraph, you can criticize the president, but you can't make fun of him. Maybe there's a little tiny smidgen of irony there. I then put in a definition of irony, the use of words to express something other than, and especially the opposite of the literal meaning. Well, maybe coronation fits into that category, because of course it's not a coronation. It's a republic, but it's ironically close to a coronation. I won't go through all the things I wrote here, but you might want to look at that. And possibly coronation in a republic also works for another meaning of irony, incongruity between the actual result of a sequence of events and the normal or expected result. It's ironic that a republic is so good at putting on a coronation ceremony. Maybe. So I think I cannot exclude irony. I then asked, is it xenophobic? And I think Janaina and I agree here, really, that really xenophobia. Xenophobia is presented in some dictionaries as fear or strong dislike of people from other countries. And I think that's not exactly what's in the text. I would definitely agree with Janaina here. It's more sarcasm, and it's a sort of special kind of dislike or mistrust that, I'm sorry to say, the British, who are quite xenophobic sometimes, that the British hold for their transatlantic cousins. The relationship between Britain and the United States is strange, a sort of mixture of the British knowing that that America is much more important and influential, but kind of to make up for that, the British are always criticizing Americans in rather, I would say actually nowadays we'd probably call it passive aggressive ways, but it used to be called sarcasm. So I think that sarcasm is the main feeling rather than xenophobia here. Xenophobia is much more outright. It's not really passive aggressive at all. It's just like, you're foreign, you're bad. Whereas sarcasm is kind of like, oh, well, given that you're so great, haven't you thought of this? And it is something that British people believe, that Americans can't laugh at themselves. I've no idea really if it's true or not. I haven't been to the United States for decades. And the Americans I know personally do seem able to laugh at themselves. So I think the article is exploiting a cliche and being quite sarcastic about the lack of sense of humor, perhaps, towards the idea of Trump being crown in his US Republic. And then about capital letters, Janaina asked actually not really about capital letters, but about vice president. I'm going to go down to the example I gave. Oh, I didn't give actually. The Economist Style Guide gave about capital letters. And interestingly, they did put a hyphen in vice president. And I have added or without the hyphen, especially in North America. I did a little research about this, and it does actually seem much more common to leave out the hyphen, especially if you write US English. But even in British English, it's really common to leave it out. I simply got this from the Economist Style Guide, and the Economist does have some things that it does a bit differently. However, you know, if I get the Chicago Style Manual or the New York Times Style Guide, they'll do some things differently from each other and from Oxford or Cambridge or The Economist or the London Review of Books. This is the problem with English. There isn't a kind of rule book that I can hold up and say, this is your Bible, you must follow it. So yes, you can put a hyphen in vice president, but you do not have to, and it's slightly more common without. About capital letters, with people, you'll see that there's a certain amount of detail here. The thing I tend to remember is when it's used as the title, like President Biden, next to each other, nothing else added. It's his title, use a capital. King Charles, same thing. King Charles III, same thing. But if you have if you're just talking about the Colonel, the Pope, the Queen, or now the King, you don't put capitals. All right, going up to what else I said about capitals. I added that capital letters can be used for other things that are not, they're not really about rules, they're just about style. You shouldn't do this actively. You should follow the rules, but you may find it helpful to think that capital letters can have some symbolic effect, obviously in Portuguese as well as in English. Sometimes there may be some irony or humor, like I told him this was not a good idea, and it's in capitals to make it sort of sound like I'm using this stupid voice. And I mean by that, it's a very bad idea. And the capital letters give the idea of perhaps even more understatement than irony. Here, irony or possibly sarcasm. He saw himself as a very important person. Using capitals in these situations is perhaps a bit like using inverted commas. Again, just don't do it yourself. It's a stylistic device that you won't need in a summary or a composition, but it's good to recognize that it has this understatement or ironic or sarcastic feeling about it. And of course, just like in probably most languages, if you put a whole word in capitals, it emphasizes it, probably without any irony. That's a really great idea. You could also underline it several times, but in typing, you would capitalize it. And, you know, we all know that in messages, if everything's in capitals, it's a bit shouty. So people, you know, tend not to like it very much. And nobody asked any questions about the expressions. I think I gave all the options that were possible here. So I'm just going on down the file to check what else I put in here. So that was capital letters. Oh yes, I added a longer note on every meaning each member of a group. And just to highlight that Cambridge says it's a singular verb. And about referring back to it or its for non-human. And then using they or their. It says in less formal styles. It's formal enough for your composition and your summary. You do not need to write he or she, his or her every time you use every. That's, it's now becoming really rather old-fashioned. Okay, so I think that's the end of the file. And indeed, that's the end of the class. Please do send comments. This is a different class, and I hope it was reasonably useful. But if you want something very different, you can either send a message on the group or privately. And Peter will be with you next week, probably doing something a bit different. And let's hope the Edutal comes out very soon. So I hope you have a good and not too stressful few days ahead. And thank you for listening. Bye-bye.